Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Rick Cromie. Welcome to this next section in the Lewis and Clark story, where I'm going to take you from St. Louis all the way upriver, up through the Midwest area of Kansas and Nebraska and South Dakota, North Dakota, to the Mandan Villages, where they're going to winter in the fall of 1804 to the spring of 1805. And in this particular period, it is a fascinating part of the Lewis and Clark story. Absolutely fascinating. It is a moment in time where so many things happen, and there are so many events that could have been really the end of the core discovery. By April of 1804, the core discovery was just about ready to leave St. Louis. There were still some things they had to finish up. There was obviously some just detail stuff and everything, but they wanted to be totally ready. And they had no idea what to expect. I mean, let's be candid. They had no idea what was going to happen, what to expect. They were just men on an adventure, and young men on an adventure. In fact, I love what John Ordway writes to his parents. In fact, I imagine many of the men wrote letters to their parents, but a few have been kept for historical sake. And I love what he wrote on April 8th of 1804. He said, "Honored parents, I am now on an expedition to the westward with Captain Lewis and Captain Clark to the Western Ocean. This party consists of 25 picked men, and I am so happy as to be one of them." Now, the reality is that there were more than 25. In fact, we're going to find out there's closer to 43. It's almost double the amount that Ordway had mentioned. Jefferson himself sent a farewell to the Corps. He said, quote, "I hope you will take care of yourself. Assure all of your party," he's speaking here to Lewis, "that we have our eyes turned on them with anxiety for their safety and the success of their enterprise."
On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery left their winter encampment in Illinois, crossed the Mississippi River, and finally headed up the Missouri.
When the astronauts went to the moon, they'd seen pictures of it. They knew what to expect. When Lewis and Clark headed out, they didn't have the slightest notion of what to expect. It was more unknown to them than to the astronauts.
May 25th. Set out early this morning and proceeded on. Passed a French village called La Charrette. This is the last settlement of whites on this river. Sergeant Charles Floyd.
Sergeant Charles Floyd was a 22-year-old Kentuckian, a young man of much merit, Lewis noted. Beyond that, not much is known about Floyd or the other members of the crew. Stout, healthy, unmarried men, Lewis called them, accustomed to the woods and capable of bearing bodily fatigue. They came from nearly every corner of the nation. John Ordway was a young soldier from Hebron, New Hampshire. Joseph Whitehouse was a tailor from Virginia. And Patrick Gass was a carpenter who came from Irish stock in Pennsylvania. Reuben and Joseph Field were brothers. George Drouillard, Francois Labiche, and Pierre Cruzat were the sons of white fathers and Indian mothers. In addition, Lewis took with him his big Newfoundland dog. And William Clark brought along a slave he had owned since childhood, a black man named York.
And just so you understand the timeline here, Lewis is still stuck in St. Louis. Clark has the men, and they're going to leave Wood River Camp, and they're going to head up to St. Charles, which is a little bit to the west of St. Louis there. And Lewis is still stuck doing work there in St. Louis. So he's going to join up with them a bit later, about a week later. He's going to join up with them, but they're going to stop there at St. Charles and have a few days of rest and relaxation as they prepare to leave. And again, we have a journal entry from Patrick Gass this time that I think is very interesting. Listen to what he has to say. He says on May 14th, 1804, the Corps consisted of 43 men, part of the regular troops of the United States and part engaged for this particular enterprise. The best authenticated accounts informed us that we were to pass through a country possessed by numerous, powerful, and warlike nations of gigantic stature, fierce, treacherous, and cruel, and particularly hostile to white men. This is no Sunday school picnic. Patrick Gass already recognizes, and I'm sure the men were prepared as well, that this was yes, it was an adventure. Yes, they were going to experience land and territory, and there were all sorts of upsides to coming back successful from this one. But don't be fooled. This was going to be hard. It was going to be a very difficult time, and one of the things that they were afraid of more than anything, and I think it was a healthy fear, a healthy concern, were the Indians. They had different reports, and a lot of those reports are going to come down from Indians that are further upriver. Most of the Indian tribes that were downriver had already had a lot of conversations and interaction really with white men, and so they were fairly peaceful in their interactions. But there were some reports further upstream, and definitely once they get past the Mandan Villages into Montana and to that area, they're dealing with Indians that they really don't even know. They're just working off of reports, often from other Indians, as far as who they're going to be encountering. Let's just talk for a moment about this Missouri River. At the time that they leave, and this is going to be true also the next year when they leave Fort Mandan and get onto the Missouri River, the Missouri River is still running fairly high. It's springtime. Keep that in mind. And so the river is running high. Clark, in particular, had been monitoring the river and watching it fall, and it would rise and fall. But in springtime, it would rise to a point and then would start falling as the snows melted and the water went downstream into the Gulf of Mexico. And the Missouri River was a wild card river. Again, they only had reports about what to expect from the Frenchmen that were coming down, the traders that were coming downstream and telling them, here's what you're going to see upriver. Well, let me tell you, the Missouri River is full of sandbars. This is a river that has some current to it, and it would push that sand up in places and push it other places. And these boys, they fought sandbars the entire way. And here's the problem: as the Missouri River, as the months go on, the Missouri River the flow continues to fall, and that means that those sandbars become even more evident. It's going to become a point where they actually are going to sleep on sandbars most nights. That's going to be their quarters, their nightly place to camp, because the sandbar is out in the middle. It's fairly safe. They're out in the middle of the river. That's helpful. But also that sand is nice and soft. It makes a good bed, much better than that hard ground that they were sleeping on earlier. So, but these sandbars are there. There's also they start noticing and really journaling very early in the record how the cliffs were falling. They would notice that the water, as it rushed up against the cliffs, it would undercut these cliffs, and eventually these cliffs would just slice right off. And that's going to be a problem for them, because you don't want to be too close to a cliff when it falls, especially with one of those pirogues. It's going to swamp you, and they were constantly dealing with that. The big barge was continually getting twisted and stopped, and it would run up on some of these sandbars. It was very, very heavy, And you got a sandbar that you get stuck on, and then you got a rushing river behind you. It can twist that thing and get it moving. And there are a number of times where they had to pause and just really handle the barge. In fact, that's one of the reasons they send it back downstream at the end of this particular season. They recognize that this thing, it's nice, it was great for provisions, it got a lot of stuff upriver, but we can't take it much further. In fact, we can't take it any further than Fort Mandan up in North Dakota. They got to have more nimble type of watercraft on the river. Let's talk just briefly about what day-to-day looked like for them. They would set out very early in the morning. They would often at sunrise. In fact, that was their goal, to be literally on the river at sunrise. And so that you'd hear them we're setting out early. We're going at sunrise. So they're off and started on their day very, very early. And that's going to give them a lot of time on the water, especially as the long days of summer start to blossom for them. They're going to have plenty of time to work the river and to get those barges up. And they're moving at a fairly slow pace. Again, I think they would like to go much faster than they can, but you're talking sometimes just a dozen miles a day. There are a couple points where they get, especially further upriver, they're able to move much faster through some of the waters. Helped if they get a good southerly wind, they would hoist the sails, especially on that barge. That sail would be very helpful. But most of the winds came down from the north and the west, and they weren't helpful winds. They had to have a southerly type of wind that would fill that sail up. So they were constantly dealing with these types of problems. But they couldn't really row these boats forward. They had to use big long poles and push them in and walk them forward. And that's what they would do. You see them in the picture here. They just stick their poles in and they walk it all the way forward. And then they'd go to the back or go to the front and do it all again. And that's how they moved themselves forward. There were times when they had ropes on shore. There would be men on shore that would help pull them forward. And of course, the biggest way, or the best way, was just to get the men in the water with a nice tow rope on the front of the ship and just pull those babies forward. That barge, again, was very heavy, and that river, you can imagine, was cold, at least to start with in the season, but probably more refreshing as it went on when the heat of the summer got going. But it was a long and arduous type of task. One thing that's interesting too is that there were a lot of dangers on this particular trip. Lewis himself almost loses his life. They're not more than just a few days in, and Lewis himself falls off a cliff. He's according to the story, he's up there on top of a cliff, basically walking it, checking, looking for plants and different things like that. And he digs down, he's digging on something, and he loses his footing, and he literally falls off this 200 or 300 foot cliff. And as he's falling, he's falling to his death. I mean, let's be honest, he is literally falling to his death. Had he hit the bottom, he wouldn't have survived that particular type of fall. It would have broke his back. It was that bad of a fall. But somehow he gets his knife out and gets it stuck in the clay there in the side of that cliff, and manages to hoist himself back up to the top. And it's one of those stories that often gets lost in this incredible journey, because there are so many life-threatening events that happen to him. But in this particular case, they almost lose their captain. They almost lose their leader within the first week of this journey. One of the issues that didn't go away for the Corps Discovery was some of the shenanigans. Again, remember, these are boys, these are young men, and they are on a military mission. Clark and particularly Lewis, but both Lewis and Clark have these guys hopefully whipped into shape. But I mean, they're not. There's still an element in the Corps Discovery that still hasn't figured it out. And they are pushing buttons, and they are pushing limits, and they are basically doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. And one of those particular individuals was a man by the name of Hugh Hall. And he got himself into trouble for drawing whiskey. He was drawing whiskey one night, got himself in trouble. Another man named Collins was actually drunk on guard. I mean, he was on the guard and he got drunk, and in the same incident, and they held a court martial for them on June 29th of that summer, and it was harsh. I mean, Collins got 100 lashes on his bare back, and Hugh Hall himself got 50 lashes, and all he did was draw the whiskey out of the barrel, although he probably drank a little bit himself. The bottom line is they were disobeying orders. That whiskey was meant, it was rationed out for the men to have during the evening supper. It was not meant to be just for anybody to go into and enjoy. And but after dark, some of these men got a little gamey and took advantage of some of the provisions as they were there. Another guy named Alexander Willard, he on July 12th fell asleep on his post. And he had his own court martial. Now, Willard's an interesting guy. I gotta tell you, you gotta love a guy named Alexander Willard to begin with. I mean, he kind of has that folksy name, and that's the type of boy that he was. That's the type of the man that he was. He was I think, kind of a simple man, and he was just tired. I mean, these guys worked hard all day long, pulling those pirogues and that barge up that river, and then they also had to stand out guard. Some of them guard all night long, and Willard just was one of those guys that fell asleep. Now, it was very important for them to maintain a guard overnight. Obviously, there was Indians in the area, but there were also wild animals, wolves and coyotes and other types of thieves, if you will, of the animal four-legged kind that were there. And it was the job of the guard basically to make sure that the men could get their sleep and not be pestered and bothered. In fact, the only thing that really bothered them all summer long was the mosquitoes and the ticks. Early on in this season, the ticks were also troublesome, and the journals were very numerous in entries on this particular one were the mosquitoes. They were just getting bit like crazy. And on that sandbar, a lot of those mosquitoes just swarmed on those sandbars, and the men just became easy pickings. And just that just wasn't good for them, and they suffered. Now they're going to enter Kansas on June 26th of 1804. They're going to enter Nebraska on July 11th of 1804. Not too long after that, they're going to have their first reality check. It's when they name a particular island, and they were naming islands and stuff all the way up. That was part of their job. They're claiming this territory, and so they're naming islands. And they named one particular island Butter Island. And the reason for that, we're told in the journals, is because that was the day that the last of the butter was consumed. You got to figure they've only been upriver 2 months, and they're already out of butter, and they're going to be out of a lot of other things before this thing is over. They have a lot of items, provisional items, that will disappear slowly as they're consumed in the coming months and years. But butter was gone fairly early, and so they named this particular island Butter Island. They also had other fun names that they gave to particular places, like Baker's Oven and No Preserves and Biscuit and places like that. I think it kind of helped the men to stay in good spirits. But they were naming these places up and down, these rivers as well, these little creeks that would come in. Everything got a name. It was part of their job. Also part of their job, a big part of their job, really one of the major goals of this particular mission, was to meet with the Indians. And once they get into Nebraska, just south of Omaha, they're going to meet their first band of Indians. And it was a tribe known as the Otos. And they met the Otos on August 2nd of 1804. And we're going to get to them in just a moment. I want to show you on this map the Indian tribes that they met on this leg of the journey. They're going to meet many others after Mandan, in the coming year and a half. But right now, these are the ones that they meet just on this particular leg. Just past the Otos, they're going to meet the Omaha. And then they're going to meet the Yankton. The Yankton are a band, a form of Sioux. And then they're going to meet the Teton Sioux. We're going to spend some time with the Teton Sioux because they're like the mafia of the Missouri, and they almost stopped the Lewis and Clark mission. I mean, dead, stopped it. And when I say dead, I don't mean that in a figurative term. They wanted and to kill the core discovery, each and every one of these men. They're also going to meet the Arikara, and then finally up in the Mandan Villages, that's where they're going to encounter the Mandans and the Hidatsas and the Assiniboine and other tribes that are around that particular neck of the woods. Well, let's go back and look just at one of these because they were a traveling road show in the summer of 1804. They're a bit like a circus. They would come in, especially with these Indians. They would come in and they'd have this big show that they put on. They do a parade before the chiefs. Usually, what they do is they bring some chiefs in for a council. It's where we get the name Council Bluffs. If you've ever been to Omaha, across the river is Council Bluffs. Even though they didn't technically council at that particular location where Council Bluffs, Iowa's at, Council Bluffs was a name that was given for where they met the Omaha, and they had a council with them. Now, at these councils, they would bring in the chiefs again, and they usually start with a big military parade. All these men would put on their finest uniform, and then they would march in. They'd parade in with flags and all that. And there would be a time of speeches where Meriwether Lewis and William Clark would give this speech. It was, I think, a speech that was, it was very simple. This speech was very simple. Basically, you have a new great father. So back in Washington, D.C., we're emissaries, we're ambassadors of this great father. And we're here to tell you that our great father here wants us all to live in peace. Now, you're seeing us go upriver. We're just going upriver on a goodwill mission. We're just exploring this area. We're just checking it out. But this area now is under the United States of America. It's not French anymore. Spanish aren't going to fly their flags. So this is now our territory. And it was a message basically of showing transfer of ownership of the land. Now, the Indians, for the most part, and particularly those ones that weren't Teton Sioux, were very open to this message. It's remarkable how open they are. But again, if you've been bullied by a particular tribe upstream, you're going to want to have some help, assistance in protection. And the Teton Sioux definitely had a reputation for being difficult to work with, not just among the Indians, but also among the French. So, in fact, reports were already streaming down, and Jefferson had warned them even about this, that you're going to meet this band of Indians known as the Teton, and just walk lightly, act right, But back with the Otos took full advantage of this. And so after the speeches and the parades and all that, there would be a time where they would just exchange gifts. Usually it was really a gift giving moment. They would give them a number of, sometimes robes, sometimes battle axes, sometimes, even little trinkets, little mirrors and beads and different things like that. They gave every chief one of these. It was a big medal, and it's fairly weighty. This is an actual replica of the medal. On the front side is a picture of Thomas Jefferson, their new great father, and then on the back side are two hands clasping, and these two hands clasping with peace pipes and an axe there. You can kind of see it crossed there. It's basically saying peace and friendship. Peace and friendship. This was what they wanted from all the Indians, not just peace and friendship with these Americans, this new great father and Lewis and Clark and this American party, but also peace and friendship among the Indians. And like I said, that sold pretty well. the Indians were tired of the wars. I mean, especially some of these nations like the Arikara, they were really getting tired of it. The Mandans were getting tired of it. So they were constantly warring against each other, trying to find space because, the Tetons didn't originate in this area. They moved. They were being pushed out of their own land, and they moved and they got in this area and they just kind of set up shop, and they were the mafia of the Missouri. They were known as pirates. In fact, that's what Clark will call them. He calls them pirates of the Missouri. They were known for their behavior and their difficulty. And one of the other things that was very important, obviously, as you're heading with a bunch of men, on the river, and that is food. And this part of the journey, these guys ate a lot of meat. It really started back in Missouri. They weren't too far, upriver when they started to run into woods full of venison. The deer population was heavy, and so they were having venison just about every single night. They also had black bear and turkey and swan and ducks and all sorts of different types of things. And on August 13th to the 20th, they went fishing, and for better part of a week. And the reason why they're stopped here, by the way, is they were looking for the Omaha. The Omaha hadn't yet shown up, and they were trying to locate them. The Indians were actually off hunting buffalo, but Lewis and Clark and the men were working the river, so the buffalo weren't around the river. They saw the buffalo occasionally downriver, but most of the buffalo they're going to encounter is going to be further upriver. But anyway, they stop for a week of fish camp while they wait for a band of the Indians to get off so they can have a council with them. And during that time, they literally catch, 1,000 or more fish. They were just really bringing in the fish. Every type of fish you can think of, they brought in. It's also during this time that a tragedy befalls the Corps Discovery. This is when one of their sergeants dies. Now, he has been sick for the better part of a month. He started to complain of stomach ailments. His name's Charles Floyd. Started to complain of stomach ailments back in July. And, they were enough just to kind of stop him in his tracks, you might say. And he really suffered. And of course, the answer to everything was Dr. Rush's pills, his Thunderbolt pills to wash him out and flush him out. And, in the end, that's really not what he's going to need. They had, Lewis suspected it was something like colic. His stomach was bound up in some way. And that's another reason why the pills would maybe help release that. Charles Floyd is going to die on August 20th of 1804, and he's going to be a casualty, not of an arrowhead, not of a bullet, not of falling off a cliff, not of being gored by a buffalo, not of being frozen to death, not of anything that the Corps Discovery is going to face along the way. Those are all dangers I just listed. They're going to face over and over and over again. He's going to die. Most historians, most of us believe now, of a ruptured appendix. He's going to die of a ruptured appendix. That's interesting, because of all the things that could kill you on this particular journey, he dies of something that even Dr. Rush, Benjamin Rush back in Philadelphia, couldn't heal him from. There was no way. Once his appendix bursted, he was basically septic, and he was dying from the inside out. It's a very painful, terrible, tragic way to die. And this young man did it for almost a month. But on August 20th, after staying up all night, Clark stayed up with him all night, tending to him. York even was there, tending to him. Many of the men came in and tended to him as well. Prayers were given, I'm sure. They were doing everything possible to keep this man alive, but he couldn't keep anything down at the end. He was a mess. And he passes away on the morning of August 20th, and they're going to bury him on a bluff high above the Missouri River. And they're going to call that Charles Floyd's Bluff, or Floyd's Bluff. They're going to name it in his honor. They're going to name a little stream down below in his honor as well. This is going to become the spot where they realize that this is not, again, a Sunday school picnic. This is life and death at times. And they never expected one of their sergeants of all people, one of their sergeants, to be one of the casualties. But that creates a hole in the sergeants as far as their command. And with Charles Floyd now out of the picture, being one of the sergeants, they have to have another sergeant step in. And the man that the men pick, the men initially did kind of a democratic process. The men picked him, and that man was Patrick Gass, a good old carpenter from back east. And Patrick Gass had already established himself as a man who was very valuable in the mission. He was someone who was respected, someone who was hardworking, someone that the men looked up to. And he's now replacing Charles Floyd. This is also about the time that the scenery begins to change. Lewis is going to make mention of this in his journal on September 17th of 1804. He says the scenery, already rich, pleasing, and beautiful, was still further heightened by immense herds of buffalo, deer, elk, and antelope, which we saw in every direction, feeding on the hills and in the plains. They literally brought these ships into a brand new ecosystem. They had moved out of the high, the wooded areas of Missouri and Kansas and southern Nebraska into that wooded. They moved in Illinois, and they now moved into the great desert of North America. We call it the Midwest. The grasslands were just immense. You could literally see for miles and miles and miles ahead. And everywhere they looked, it was like the American Serengeti. Everywhere they looked, they saw herds of something, whether it was elk or deer or buffalo or antelope. Everywhere they looked, they saw animals, they saw game. And that's one of the reasons why they ate so well. On this particular leg of the journey, they are eating very, very well. And in fact, they're eating about 9 pounds of meat a day per man. So keep that in mind. That's a pretty good chunk of protein, which is another reason why Dr. Benjamin Rush's Thunderbolt pills were necessary. As I've mentioned before, they were good for flushing you out, and protein tends to bind you up. So his pills were there for a reason, and it was to keep them flushed out. But that protein out there on those plains became very significant, and they saw a lot of them. Well, on September 24th through the 25th, they're going to finally meet the Teton Sioux. And this is a moment in the story that there is so much going on that I'm going to allow Ken Burns in his documentary on Lewis and Clark. I'm going to let him take over at this point.
On the morning of September 25th, near what is now Pierre, South Dakota, the Corps of Discovery met the Teton Sioux. While large numbers of Lakotas gathered on both sides of the river, chiefs named Black Buffalo, the Partisan, and Buffalo Medicine, along with 30 warriors, came over to talk. Even William Clark, who had been in scrapes with Indians before, seemed anxious.
Gave the 3 chiefs 3 new medals and 1 American flag, some knives and other small articles of goods. They did not appear to talk much until they had got the goods, and then they wanted more, and said we must stop with them or leave one of the canoes with them, as that was what they expected. John Ordway.
The Teton Sioux tried to force a toll that was beyond the expedition's ability to pay. And when the expedition wouldn't pay it, not enough tobacco, not enough whiskey, not enough beads, not enough guns, which was principally what they wanted, they made an attempt to stop the expedition.
When Clark brought the chiefs back to shore after showing them the keelboat, 3 warriors seized his canoe's tow rope. The Partisan began arguing with Clark, who drew his sword. Along the bank, Lakota warriors notched their arrows. On board the keelboat, Lewis loaded the cannon. The fate of the entire expedition hung in the balance.
Captain Clark told them that we must and would go on, that we were not squaws, but warriors. The chief said he had warriors too, and if we were to go on, they would follow us and kill and take the whole of us by degrees.
This was the tensest moment because you had hundreds of Indians on the riverbank with their bows strung, and Clark with his sword drawn, ready to drive it through the heart of the Teton Sioux chiefs if they didn't let go of the cord of that canoe that they were trying to hold on to force this payment. Clark was ready to act. I felt myself grow warm, he wrote in his journal.
At that moment, Black Buffalo intervened and diplomatically changed the subject. His only request, he said, was that the women and children of his village also be allowed to come and see the keelboat and meet the explorers before they moved on. Clark quickly agreed, and for 3 more days, the expedition nervously stayed among the Lakota.
They appear to be the most friendly people I ever saw, but they will steal and plunder if they can get an opportunity. About 15 days ago, they had a battle with the Omahas. They killed 65 men and took 25 women prisoners. They took the 65 Omaha scalps and had them hung on small poles, which their women held in their hands when they danced. They had drums and whistles for music. They kept it up until 1 o'clock, dancing war dances around the fire, which was curious to us. Joseph Whitehouse.
By the time the expedition moved on, Clark had formed an opinion of the Lakotas different from his attitude toward all other Indians.
These are the vilest miscreants of the savage race, and must ever remain the pirates of the Missouri until such measures are pursued by our government as will make them feel a dependence on its will for their supply of merchandise. William Clark.
Well, as you can imagine, once they got past the Teton Sioux, they really put it in B for boogie. They moved up that river at some of the fastest speeds of all summer long. Now, partly because they're behind schedule. The Teton Sioux and the other bands of Indians behind them had slowed them up, and they still have other Indians to meet. In fact, the next band of Indians they're going to meet are the Arikara. And the Arikara were more of an agricultural type of community, but they were bullied, horrifically bullied by the Teton Sioux, and they were very open to the message of Lewis and Clark, and they liked the idea of the firepower. I didn't mention this, but once they got done with these councils, they always would take the chiefs over to the barge, and they would show off the technology that was on that barge. This is one of the reasons why the Teton Sioux wanted them to stop. Not only did they not want them going upstream and doing any more exploration in what they considered their land, but they looked at this barge and they saw all this stuff. They saw firepower. They saw cannons. One of the things I mentioned before in my earlier session, they had this air cannon, and they would blow off this air cannon. It was so loud. The boom was so loud that the Indian chiefs would just laugh and laugh at that. They loved that type of firepower. It was a big fireworks show and everything. They just enjoyed it. And that's exactly what was going on there with the Tetons. Is you had Lewis and Clark show off their stuff, and then the Tetons said, well, why don't you just stick around here, boys, for a few more days, and we'll show you our stuff too. And that's what the war dances were all about. You know, that you heard a little bit of it in that video, but the reason why those Tetons had 2 days, actually 2 nights of war dances, and they would start beating that drum and it would just get louder and louder and louder and whistles going and everything. They say you could hear it for miles, okay, on that prairie. But and then the women would start dancing, and they back then they had a pole dance of their own. The women did, not like we have today, but this pole dance was one where they had on top of it were the scalps of their enemies, and all that was to send a message. It was a message to Lewis and Clark. You think you're tough? Well, we're pretty tough too. You think you own this land? Yeah, we got news for you. We own this too. You think that you are ready to fight and you got a lot of firepower? Well, look around. There are hundreds of us. There was literally hundreds, over 1,000 of these Sioux, Teton Sioux in the area. We got plenty of people on our side too. But when they got up to the Arikara were just totally the opposite with them. They were very welcoming. They were very embracing. They were very friendly. One of the people that got particularly befriended was York. When York got in there with the Arikara, they were fascinating, and the same thing's going to happen up with the Mandans as well, the Mandan and the Hidatsas, but particularly the Mandans. They've seen white French traders and, of course, other Indians, but they've never seen a black man. And York, according to the testimony, was black as coal. He was just a black as coal man. So, and he was very muscular, very good looking man. And, you know, the Indians, their stories, and I love this picture by Charlie Russell where he's, you know, the Indians are trying to rub off the blackness, because that's exactly what they did. They caressed every part of his body. They liked to play with his curly hair. It was quite the moment. But York was also kind of causing his own little problems. He liked to tease a bit. And one of the stories he would tell him is that he was a wild animal at one point, and because now he's Clark's servant, that Clark caught him out in the wild and tamed him like you would tame a wild dog into a domesticated animal. And, you know, he told that story. Clark didn't like that, by the way. He didn't like York telling that type of story. Another thing he would do is the kids just loved York. They would follow, the little Indian kids would just follow York all around the camps and stuff as he walked, and every now and then he'd just turn around real quick and go boom, and these kids would just, you know, they'd all frighten and run away, and he would ha 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 ha, you know. But he would also do feats of strength. You know, he'd break things with his bare arms and show off his guns and stuff like that. And he was very, very popular among the Arikara and as well as the Mandans. You know, the Ricos again were open. In fact, they were so open that they put a chief on board and sent him upriver with Lewis and Clark to meet with the Mandans and just say, hey, listen, can't we all just get along? We're coming up here. Let's just stop this warring, because the Mandans and the Arikaras were at war as well very often. And they did that during the summer times. So this is now getting towards the end of the season, and they're all just kind of tired of fighting. You can imagine they've been out buffalo hunting and finding provisions, but they also been fighting with each other, and they're just all tired. And especially these tribes that were a little bit more bullied, were just tired of fighting other bullied tribes and just saying, listen, we got to just band together and just live in peace. Let's live in peace. We already got enough problems downriver with the Teton. We don't need to have problems between us. Well, the Corps is going to enter North Dakota on October 14th. And that's something to keep in mind. Look at the time of the year. Now it's mid-October, and, you know, the trees are now turning colors. The temperatures are now dipping. It's getting cold. In fact, they start to have their first frost. They start to even have a light snow every now and then. And they realize that winter is coming and they've got to get stopped. And they finally do stop at a place called the Mandan Villages. And the Mandan Villages are quite the place. It was a collection of different tribes, primarily the Hidatsa and the Mandans, but also the Assiniboine were in there. There were some other tribes that would come up there as well and stay. But they say that this collection of villages the population of them exceeded that of St. Louis, of Washington, D.C. at that time, even Cincinnati. This was a large city on a hill there in North Dakota. It was also the last point on the map. It was the last place that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had on their maps. So they knew when they got to the Mandan Villages that after this, they were off the map. Everything further west on the Missouri was uncharted territory. And they're going to winter in the Mandan Villages there. They're going to find their spot. They find a little spot on the north side of the river across from the Mandan Villages in a grove of trees, these cottonwood trees. But it made great material for building a fort. It also made great material for firewood. And they're going to need a lot of firewood that year, that season, because that winter it gets brutally cold. North Dakota is cold already, but when you get the wind blowing and the temperatures, the actual temperatures dipping down to 12 below and 20 below and 35 below and 45 below, you can imagine, the wind chills into the negative 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s. They didn't chart wind chill factor back then, but it was brutal cold. And they are going to survive this frozen tundra for several months. Now, fortunately, it's really just the months of December and January that are particularly cold. The good thing is that they did have moments of celebration, though, that winter. Christmas. I love what Patrick Gass says Christmas was like for them. The morning was ushered in, Christmas morning, with 2 discharges of the swivel cannon. So they had a big boom boom to go there, and a round of small arms by the whole corps. So every one of them got to shoot off their arms. Captain Clark then presented each man a glass of brandy, and they hoisted the American flag in the garrison. That was the first time they hoisted that flag. They didn't finish the fort. They never would hoist the flag until the fort was finished. And so in this case, they built the fort. It was a triangle. It was 2 barracks, and it was a triangle barrack. And so they built the barracks first on either side. So it was a triangle like that. And then they put a picket fence as the base across the bottom of it. And they didn't finish the pickets until like the Christmas Eve was when they finished that. And so that was that fence. When that finally was finished, then they could put the flag up. They never put the flag up until the fort was finished. Isn't that interesting? But in Patrick Gass's comment here in his journal, he also says after that, they cleared out one of the rooms and they commenced the dancing. And the dancing was very interesting for them. Boy, they could dance. They had dances almost every night. Peter Crozat would get out his fiddle and would play. And there were a couple others that knew how to something on the fiddle, but Peter Crozat was noted for his fiddle playing, and they would dance. One of the dance, a man by the name of Francois Revette, a French man, would dance on his head to the wild delight of anybody who was in the room, including the Indians. Throughout this whole winter, with the exception of Christmas Day, the Indians would come over. Once that river froze solid, I mean, they were over back and forth. They used that river like an interstate back and forth between the Mandan Villages and Fort Mandan. They'd have dozens of Indians every single day come over. And especially later when they got the blacksmith shop open, these Indians were coming over because they wanted their axes sharpened and they wanted tomahawks made. Remember, they're a warring type of community, so they needed to have new artillery. So, I mean, they were busy, and that was really helpful to the Corps Discovery because they were having problems getting meat at that point. By the time February rolls around, they're about out of meat. Food was in short supply, so the blacksmith shop doing all these ironworks for the Mandans and the Hidatsas, and what they would do in trade is they would trade ironworks. We'll make you an axe, but it's going to cost you a bushel of corn. Now, the big question that particular season, really all the way through, but they knew the captains were already talking about this. The big question was, if they're going to continue up this Missouri and they were going to come to the headwaters of the Missouri, they knew that they couldn't continue any further by boat. I mean, how do you go further by boat? There's no more river. They were going to need some horses. And as they're talking with the Mandans and the Hidatsas, they're asking this big question. We're going to need horses. Where do we get horses? We don't need horses now, but we will need horses later. And we're going to need horses for every one of the men. So we don't just need a few horses. We need a lot of horses. Where are we going to find him? And in one of those meetings, they come across a man by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau. He's a French trader, and he happens to have 2 wives. And these wives are Shoshone wives, Indian wives. And it's very well known among the Hidatsas and others that the Shoshone have a large herd of horses. And so Lewis and Clark realized right away, we've got to get to the Shoshone. The Shoshone do a lot of their summer buffalo hunting there in southwest Montana. Primarily, they're up in the mountains, but they come down to the plain areas there in Montana, especially in the southwest part of Montana. They come out of the mountains to go down and they hunt for buffalo for the winter, and they get their supply. So they had a pretty good idea they were going to run into the Shoshone Indians there in southwest Montana, but they needed to have a translator. And lo and behold, here is Charbonneau. Now, here's the problem. Charbonneau doesn't know Shoshone, but he's got a wife named Sacagawea who does. Sacagawea is one of his brides, and she's going to go along with him, and they're going to hire Charbonneau, who turns out to be basically worthless. They're going to hire Charbonneau, but who they really want and need is Sacagawea. That was the big question. And they meet Charbonneau and Sacagawea in early November, and it becomes a very important relationship. It's a relationship that at one point Charbonneau later in the spring is going to exploit. He's going to think, well, you know what? You need me a lot for this one, so I'm going to kind of barter a bit with my power here. And he actually quits just about a month before they leave. He actually quits the expedition, and the captains let him quit. They said, "Fine, you're gone. You know, we're fine. We'll figure something else out. We'll get her done." And he's gone for like 5 days, and he realizes, you know, this is stupid. I need to go on this mission. I need, you know, they're getting paid for this. So, you know, he comes back with his tail between his legs and basically says, "I'm sorry. I was very foolish and all." And he comes back. Of course, again, the captains, they bring him right back, but they're not after Charbonneau. They don't need Charbonneau's services. He can speak Hidatsa, but they already have some others that can speak Hidatsa with them. What they need is someone who can speak Shoshone.
Throughout the winter, Meriwether Lewis's primitive medical skills were continually pressed into service. He had to amputate the frozen toes of an Indian boy without anesthesia or a surgical saw. By late January, many of the men showed signs of venereal disease, which Lewis treated with a salve of mercury. And on the bitterly cold evening of February 11th, Lewis made a most unusual house call. A baby was being born, and the young mother was having trouble with the delivery. Her name was Sacagawea, a Shoshone girl who had been captured several years earlier by the Hidatsas and then sold to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader. Learning that the Shoshones lived near the headwaters of the Missouri and thinking they might need a good interpreter when they reached it, the captains had hired Sacagawea's husband, knowing she would come with him.
She's called a lot of different names. Sacagawea, Sacagawea, Bird Woman. She's a teenager. She's about 16 years old. She's one of 2 wives of Toussaint Charbonneau. She's pregnant when they hire her. But they knew that she would be essential, and she became one of the most important members of the expedition.
But now she was in labor. It was excruciatingly slow, Lewis noted, and the pain violent. Someone suggested that the rings of a rattlesnake, crushed into powder and given with water, sometimes helped ease and speed a baby's delivery. Lewis got some from his collection of animal skins and plants. Sacagawea was given the rattlesnake potion.
Whether this medicine was truly the cause or not, I shall not undertake to determine. But she had not taken it more than 10 minutes before she brought forth.
It was a boy whom Charbonneau named Jean-Baptiste, and the captains agreed that when spring finally came, he could go west with them as the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery.
So as we just saw, on February 11th of 1805, Sacagawea has a baby boy. And it was a very tedious and painful, violent was the word that Meriwether Lewis used as far as a birth goes. Now, Sacagawea, let's talk just briefly about Sacagawea. She is known as Bird Woman, and that name was given to her. We don't know whether that name was given to her by the Hidatsas or whether it was her original Shoshone name. She was captured when she was about 10 years of age. So, you know, I'm not, I don't have a dog in this hunt. I don't have to say that it was a Hidatsa name. Definitely it was, Sacagawea was a Hidatsa name, but she could have been called Bird Woman as a Shoshone Indian. And then when she was captured, they kind of asked her name and she kept calling herself Bird Woman, and they called her Sacagawea. That's how she got the name Sacagawea. But however she got it because she's small in stature. She's just a tiny little gal. And, you know, you can imagine being pregnant and giving birth if you're a small statured woman, how painful that would be. But she's also a teenager. She's all of about maybe 16 years old at this point. And she's already given birth, and it's a very difficult birth and troubling, but Sacagawea is her name. Now, for those of us who go way back and don't have to go too far back to run into people, we grew up learning her name as Sacagawea. Sacagawea. That's how I learned her name. In fact, there are still places on the map today that have Sacagawea State Park, for example. They're in the Tri-City areas of Washington. Sacagawea. But historians in the last 20 years have pretty much settled the score. Lewis and Clark historians, we really believe the best name, the best way to pronounce her name was Sacagawea. And the thing to keep in mind is in the journals and even some of the maps, her name is spelled all sorts of different ways. And it appears 17 different times in the journals. I mean, she is mentioned a number of times. So it's spelled a number of different times as well. But again, her name was given to her by the Hidatsas. And here's why it's a Hidatsa name. It's because Sakaga means bird in Hidatsa, and Wea means woman in Hidatsa. That's not a Shoshone name. That's not a Shoshone name. That is a name that is Hidatsa. So when you see it spelled out like that, Sacagawea, it tells you, oh, Hidatsa. It's a Hidatsa name. But for me, you know, just saying her name, you know, probably the best evidence we have comes actually from Lewis in the journals. He says this on May 20th of 1805. They actually name a stream after her, and in the journal, he sounds out her name, Sacagawea, the stream we called Sacagawea, or Bird Woman's River, after our interpreter, the Snake Woman. So you can't be any clearer. That's exactly who it is. We know who he's talking about, Sacagawea. He sounds it out with a ga. Now, it is interesting that one of the nicknames the captains had for Sacagawea was Janie. And this lends credence to maybe, just maybe, it was Sacagawea. If you go down to the Shoshone tribe to this day, they will say her name is Sacagawea. I've got friends in the Shoshone tribe, and they're in eastern Idaho. And I've talked to them about this, and every one of them will say the same thing. Her name is Sacagawea. But the Hidatsas say, no, it's Sacagawea. Most Lewis and Clark historians now have kind of come back around that it is Sacagawea. My argument with my Shoshone friends is, listen, you can't get past the fact this is a Hidatsa name. Her name may have been Bird Woman before she met the Hidatsas, but they gave her the name Sacagawea because in Shoshone, there's a different name for Bird Woman, if it was put that way. So this is Hidatsa, and that's the way it is. All right. Well, we've gotten them to the Mandan Villages of North Dakota. And again, it was a very rough winter, but in the spring, of 1805. They are going to send the barge back downriver, and we're going to talk about in our next session about that. They're going to send the barge downriver, and they're going to head west. And they're going to make it this time. In this next season, they're going to make it all the way to the Pacific. If you are looking for more resources on this particular leg of the journey, I encourage you to go over to rickcromie.com and look under American Cruise Lines, because that's what I'm a historian for American Cruise Lines on the Lewis and Clark story, and all my Lewis and Clark stuff is there under American Cruise Lines. Go there and you can find the journals. I've actually gone through and I've got day to day. You can read what happened day to day in the journals, and those are there, as well as many other resources that, including the slides that go along with this particular session. They're all available for you there, rickcromie.com.